Welcome. It's great to have you here. We hope you can join us throughout the wellbeing conversation. And to those of you watching this chapter, you will notice that this is a different location from the first few chapters, but we are in COVID and we are in lockdown. We're not able to head across town to that location anymore. Hence, here I am in the living room and it's fine. As with every chapter, it is my pleasure to welcome Paralympic gold medalist and ANZ ambassador, Alcott. Dylan, great to have you here.
G'day, Brad. Great to be here, mate. I've absolutely loved being part of this series and can't wait for today's ep.
Well, this ep is all about overcoming fear and embracing the new world. And joining us today, we have Mark Hand, ANZ Group Executive, Australia, Retail and Commercial Banking. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Brad. Great to be here. Looking forward to today's conversation.
And our expert for today's conversation, joining us all the way from Copenhagen. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr Pippa Grange, psychologist, culture coach and author. Hello, Pip. Great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brad. It's great to be here with you.
Well, we are talking about overcoming fear and embracing the new world. A lot to discuss, a lot to talk about, a few stories, I imagine. So we'll get into it. So why don't we start then with our psychologist. Pippa, when we talk about fear, what is fear and where does it come from?
Great question, Brad. Fear is an energy. It's an emotional energy, and it's basically an early warning system. So without fear, we'd be in all sorts of trouble. We absolutely need it to prepare us to respond when there's a threat, when there's danger, when there's something that's likely to get in our way in a big way. And so it's designed as an early warning system that we then can turn the hazard lights off with. But unfortunately with fear, it's not very discerning and there's way too much of it. And it comes from our instinctive amygdala, our old circuitry in our brain, basically. And it'll pop up extremely quickly, extremely readily, and tell you that everything's going to go pear-shaped any minute. So we need to be able to intervene with our thinking brain, our newer circuitry, our frontal cortex, as we call it, and tell the fear what to do. So really, if we think of it as an early warning system that we need to turn off, I think that's a good start place.
I think Pippa touched on something there about how fear kind of drives your performance. Fear it invokes a response within you. So you've got to realise that it's actually quite a good thing. But that fear will drive success. It drives application to things that are important, and we can see that every day. I'm a competitive person by nature, so part of that fear of failure for me, or that fear of disappointing someone, all those sort of feelings help drive you in a workplace. And people need to understand that that's not a bad thing to feel uncomfortable and feel concerned about what the outcome might be.
Dylan, what do you fear?
Look, I used to fear a lot when I was growing up with my disability. I think that was one of the main reasons why it kind of ruined my life, to be honest. A fear of not being worthy, to be honest. The fear of not being included. That was probably my biggest fears. And one thing that I was very lucky that happened to me was I was able to overcome that. And I guess you learn to handle your fears a lot better, mostly through lived experience. So once you have that lived experience, you become comfortable with handling fear. But in saying that, when I roll out to play an Australian Open final on Rod Laver Arena, I'd be kidding myself if I didn't say that I wasn't fearful or nervous of the situation. But I couldn't agree more. I harnessed that feeling to help me perform better. Like, why else would I want to get out of bed and train every day if I didn't want to get myself into situations where I felt that in my stomach? That that feeling you get in your stomach, that empty feeling of fear or nerves or whatever it is. That's why I do what I do. And it took me a while to embrace that. But once I did, I definitely became a better athlete and I think a better person because of it.
Dil, can I just jump in on that? It's a really nice description, but that feeling in your gut is a readiness feeling, right? And it's the thought we attach to it that causes the problem. If the thought is, here we go, I'm getting out there, this is it kind of thing. I remember Glenn Archer saying that, he was sick every time he played. you know, but he started to attach the thought that that was readiness rather than attach the thought that that was something going to go wrong. I think that, you know, we've got this in the moment fear that you're talking about that's completely natural, very usable, very valuable if we attach the right thinking to it. But then there is not good enough fear, which is what you said about not feeling worthy. And not good enough fear is where all of that sort of emotional energy that we can harness well to perform becomes laced with this idea that we're going to fail, and that failing means being a loser, not just losing, but being a loser. And it's got shame and it's got all of those other things rolled into it. And when that happens, that's where the strain and the stress and the loneliness and the sense of sort of real anxiety kicks in. So the fear itself is one thing, and the emotional label that goes with that, great. But when we allow that to be just a currency that we operate with and allow it to be laced with this idea of not being good enough as a human being, that's where it goes wrong.
Yeah, I love hearing that. And I couldn't agree more. And it took me a while to realize that as well. Like what I was so worried about, and sometimes it still affects me, you know, having to win a tennis tournament to feel worthy, you know what I mean? And it's taken me a lot of practice to get over that. But what I found was, which is what you just said, and I love hearing it because you're the expert and I'm just a tennis player. So I'm going to write that down. But what I can bring to it is my mindset to that feeling and how I view that feeling. And it actually can be a competitive advantage because I look at the people I'm playing or whatever it is. In my case, it's tennis, but in everybody's watching case, it might be in a business sense or a personal sense or whatever. You know, other people don't see it as that. They see it, as you said, as a negative aspect, which is a problem. And I think converting the way that we view it can actually really be a positive thing that we actually use into our lives. So I'm on the right track, I feel like. I love hearing that from you, Pip. That's good.
You are. You most definitely are.
So, Mark, when we talk about fears, are you open to sharing your fears and vulnerabilities with the people around you, knowing that out of that you develop a really strong connection?
Yeah, absolutely. I've probably been accused of being too open more than anything else in the past. I sent a note to my staff last week to let them know exactly that, you know, what I was thinking and feeling. That's to about sort of 15,000 or more people across Australia. My youngest daughter was born with an immune deficiency, and so she's in a very high risk category. So I've been at home for 22 weeks since the 10th of March I came home. And before we'd even gone into lockdown, my daughter's doctors had said, you know, try and stay off planes because at that stage they didn't know whether that was a high risk of infection. And so we decided that I would work from home from that point. And so been home for a long time, and my poor little 9-year-old who's got serious cabin fever has been out of the house twice in 22 weeks. You know, once to go get a flu injection, so that wasn't a highlight for her. And once she sat in the car while I dropped some food at her grandmother's place, who wasn't allowed out because she'd had surgery as well. And then at the same time, I've got, like a lot of us, you know, people my age, we've got ageing parents in their 80s in Queensland, health issues emerging, high-risk categories, and sort of bunkering down at home and not being able to get up there and do anything for them makes it a bit hard. There's no other family up there. So I've been very open with my team, and I was staggered with the response that I got from staff, a lot who I've never met, many that I had met, just responding, saying it made it easier for them to feel better about their own situation, realising that this impacts everybody. And I think they were really appreciative of a senior person opening up about the fact that they're a bit fearful for their own family, and that's preoccupying some of their time. And we have good days and bad days, and it's okay to have a bad day.
I love that answer, Mark. It's you know, it's exactly where we would guide leaders to go. There's such an upside to being willing to share yourself intimately, you know, in terms of fear, in terms of your emotional life with other people. But in leadership, traditional sort of leadership training has showed us never to lose control, never to put your guard down. And it's such a restriction. It creates such a degree of conformity and sort of performance that gets in the way of true results. And absolutely gets in the way of the protection that's found within connection between people. So That's such a important piece. I did some work last week for a client talking about return to work, and one of the things that we were saying was that a great option is where the leader can do emotional hangover work. You know, we do this in Olympic sports, where basically you talk about what's just happened in an event and process it. You know, it's like a short, sharp processing of how everybody felt, but you're allowed to have the emotional content in there. You know, how did you feel when you got home? What's been stressing you about your mum and dad that you can't get to and go help? That, you know, those kind of conversations, and unpack that emotional work. And I think that does two things. It allows a person to really help the processing, and it allows people to allow fear and emotion into the conversation in a way that can be processed and become useful. And you don't have to hide the amount of emotional energy, exhausting, that we put into performing who we are, and looking flawless and looking like, you know, there's no chinks in our armor, and there's no need to be anything other than, you know, this bottom line results driver. It's just too much mental rent to pay. So I love that you did that, because that kind of openness is extremely protective around mental health and around managing and dialing down fear when we're in ambiguous circumstances.
Dylan, have you learned anything about your fears during COVID?
Look, I've definitely called on the stuff that I've learned over the years to overcome what's going on at the moment. I think, and I couldn't agree any more with what has been said, especially when I had huge fears about me being self-conscious about the person that I was, having my disability and that. Guess who I told about it? I told absolutely no one. And that ruined my life for 2 years. And as soon as you released that emotional baggage and started talking about it, my life honestly changed immediately. It really did. And it was such a, you know, it was a really hard time in my life, but I'm so glad I went through it, because it was such an incredible lesson for me, because I learned to have the tools to be open about how I was feeling and things like that. But in saying that, you know, when COVID hit and the Paralympic Games got cancelled, and so did Wimbledon, and all my career got put on hold, I put up a bit of the armour that people talked about, and I was saying that I was fine and everything was okay and things like that. And it took me a few weeks to start opening up with my partner and things like that about how I was actually feeling. And how I was feeling was that it sucked and I was sad and things like that. And as soon as I started accepting that fear that I didn't know what was going to happen with my life and started communicating it, I started feeling so much better. I honestly did. You know, we are in this together at the moment, and I've learned that talking about what's going on has been the biggest asset for me to become the person that I am, but also feel comfortable in the situation that I'm in.
And Mark, have you found with the people around you at ANZ, there's a fear of working in isolation and of loneliness, particularly those people that live on their own?
There is, and sometimes it's hard to imagine what other people are working through. So I've had staff tell me that they've had a couple of kids at home, been homeschooled at the kitchen table. They're in a small house or a small apartment, and we've got younger staff who have come into the organisation early this year. A lot of graduates, for instance. They've never actually met their manager. They've certainly never met a more senior management, yet they're in meetings where they're talking to people who have never physically seen them. And this is hard. This is hard for people who aren't established in an organisation. I've just finished 32 years in ANZ, so I kind of feel like I know everyone. I know my way around, and I've got an office big enough at home that I can work out of. But when you start to talk to individuals, and I make random calls to staff all the time just to see how they're going and you know how they're coping, if there's anything else we can do for them as a bit of a pulse check. And there are so many of them that are in shared accommodation where they just can't get quiet time. There's nowhere to go other than the bedroom that they live in, and it is really hard for some people. And I crave social interaction, so I miss being in the office. And I look forward to the day when we do get to go back to the office. But there are some people in our organisation that are really struggling with this environment and this lack of interaction, or even just the lack of basic facilities that you might take for granted when you go into an office.
I think there's that's a really insightful sort of way of looking at it for the compromises. And I'm really thinking at the minute about mums who are homeschooling and trying to work full time and manage the whole thing. So it's not always mums, but it's tending to be the burden on women at the moment in regard to that. And one of the things that I think is so useful for leaders to do at the moment is to actually involve those people who are, as you say, Mark, new to the organisation or in really tricky positions, trying to balance multiple things and feeling the strain, talking about that strain, as you're obviously doing, but B, involving them in the solutions. So, Zoom burnout is a thing. And, discussing what's actually on the table for what can be compromised in terms of how much screen time, how much meeting screen time is realistic, and how are you going to rethink productivity across a period like this so that, you're not expecting 8 hours or 6 hours of constant screen time back to back, because that's going to really strain people. And then that sort of sense that, fear's a thief of your well-being and your joy. And that sense of sort of creeping up, I'm going to start getting behind here. I'm going to start looking like I'm not performing. How do I do both? And feeling not good enough in either. So I think involving people in the realistic conversations about what can be compromised is really smart, and I've seen some really great examples from companies doing, either sending equipment or, not just the sort of we love you messages, but practical things that help somebody get through the day in a socially isolated and compromised space. But the other thing I just wanted to say about that, Brad, was, you talked about loneliness, and loneliness, as we all know, is a cold abyss that nobody likes. But there's a difference between being alone and loneliness. And the difference is in whether you feel connected. It doesn't have to be physical. So those, I'm aware of some people who've got like film club and homeschooling hacks, WhatsApp groups and all sorts of other things going on that allow a sense of connectivity, even if you're alone. So the loneliness comes when there's a sense of emotional disconnection, and you feel on the outer in some way. You feel like you're not seen or you're not valid, and you're not part of something. And that doesn't, just because we have to be physically apart, doesn't mean, it doesn't have to open the door to loneliness.
Mark, have you felt when you're a leader, there's a whole lot of people looking to you for guidance and support? Is there a fear there of it being a bit too much for you at times?
Yeah, there definitely is, because no one's experienced this before. This is new to everybody, and we're making it up as we go along. And sometimes I worry that people will look to us and we will try and be too flawless in our approach, but which is why I think that vulnerability is important. We definitely made some mistakes along the way. We would have done some things differently when we look back. We did some things very well, and we learnt a lot about people. We learnt about which people really thrive in a crisis and were able to stand up and really get the most out of this environment, and which ones we needed to cut some slack because they were really stressed by what was going on in the world. And you don't know what's going on at home for a lot of people. You don't know that they haven't got family members that are suffering through this more than others. And that's why I think we've got to be vulnerable, more open, to show that we don't know all the answers, but we're prepared to listen. And if you help us, we'll get to a really good situation. And it might take us a bit longer than it would if we had a manual we could pick up off the shelf. But, it's new for everyone. And, we didn't get everything right.
Somebody said to me last week that they, even though the balance sheet's screaming at people in business and people want to sort of crank up and catch up, that really the way to approach this period of time, because it is so unusual, is as if it were just a massive restructure or something like a merger, where the principal thing to do is listen and communicate, like triple times what you normally would, because we're just all in uncertain territory, and we also don't know what the time frame is on when this might change again. So, I thought that was really good advice to treat it as if there'd been a massive organisational change, and what would we do in a planful way around that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big issues, that no one knows the end. One of the fears for us is, does this go for 2 years? Will they ever find a vaccine? Is our life changed permanently, or is there, some return to something that looks like normal in 12 months' time? We just don't know. And I think some people don't like that uncertain future.
Pippa, we can't control many things right now, but we can control our attitude. And in embracing the new world, I imagine that is going to be crucial.
Absolutely. This is a period of time, well, in fact, all periods of time, we can't control our circumstances necessarily, but we can control our approach to it, our mentality around it. And I think that there are most certainly things that we can do individually, as well as organisationally, to help that. So, in the book, I talk about this sort of overarching method of seeing what you're actually dealing with, facing it and looking at what it's costing, and how it's showing up, and then replacing it, and replacing it with something stronger and more hopeful. And those things look like, reinvigorating your sense of purpose. So beyond goals, beyond sort of the idea of what do I have to get done, to something outside of yourself. And COVID-19's offered lots of possibilities of community and creativity in that way. Like, how do we look at what's emerging and become more purposeful around it? Especially for other people. But there's also things like, I talk about useful surrender, and useful surrender is, okay, the weight of the world isn't actually all on your shoulders. There are going to be mysteries and unknowns here, and how can you let go of that and put your four corners of your feet on the floor and come back to today, and be in this moment as much as possible. And how do you self-care? How do you laugh? How do you invoke a bit more humour? Just because the smallest shift in the way that you behave with another person can have a profound impact on mood. Dill was just talking about it in his Zoom calls, his random sort of Zoom calls with people can profoundly shift somebody's experience of the day. And that's a part of surrendering to, we just can't control everything. I think that's so important. But there's also recognizing that the pen's in your hand maybe a bit more than you think it is in terms of what happens next. You can author your own story rather than wait for the news channel to tell you what's next, or the rule book, as we were saying earlier. It's not necessarily going to come in a straightforward way. So what do you want it to look like in terms of who do you want to be? How do you want to show up for other people? What do you want to have, deepened in yourself? So, I think of this as sort of a period for soul making rather than status chasing. And that's I think they're helpful ways of sort of replacing that gnawing sense of, I need to get on with it, and I don't quite feel like things are going my way, or I'm not good enough.
And that, I imagine, resonates with you, Dill, because a lot of those tools and strategies that Pip talked about, you're very familiar with. Things like humour, that's a big part of who you are.
Yeah, 100%. And that was one way that I found that it helped, me break down the stigmas around myself that I held on myself, but also the people around me, with my disability. I like to think I'm funny. I might not be funny, but sometimes I like to think that I am, Brad. But I will say that I couldn't agree more to what Pippa said then, is that the events around us aren't the be-all and end-all decision maker about what happens. It's our mindset that we bring towards these events that really determines the path that we can take at the moment. And I like that analogy of that we have got a pen in my hand, that we are the author of our own story at the moment, because yes, there is a lot of stuff going around us, but what we can control is the way that we bring our decisions and our mindset to what's going on. And it's something that, I've learned in my sporting career to do, but I've also tried to put into my personal lives. And I'm going to that toolbox a lot at the moment, you know what I mean? Because every time you turn on the news or whatever, there's something else hugely negative happening, and that can have a strain on you, you know what I mean? And you have to make those decisions to sometimes, stay up to date, but push them aside and to look after yourself and to have a laugh and to do things that you need to do to make yourself and your family and the people that you care about feel better.
So a question for all of you, and we'll start with you, Mark. If we need to make the most of the lighter moments, can you give us an example in the last few weeks, perhaps, when you had a real good belly laugh, something that made you feel great?
Probably something I've seen on TV. I've watched a lot of English television lately. I got stuck into a few English cop shows, which I really like. Line of Duty, if you haven't watched that, that is an absolute cracker of a show. But I probably took a leaf out of my son's book, who doesn't really watch TV, and he goes from YouTube to YouTube to YouTube, and he just watches something, and that throws him out to another link. And instead of watching something on TV, a series, I've just let myself organically fly the way through the YouTube world and find things I probably otherwise wouldn't have found.
Yeah, nice. What about you, Pip? What have you enjoyed? What are the lighter moments that help get you through?
I love a bit of irony, so I've had to travel a couple of times lately and be in airports, and it's to get back in an airport and in that sort of, process of being necessarily close to people when you're thinking about social distancing and everybody's sort of, trying to follow the rules, and it's quite stressful. But I did have a really good laugh last week when I saw somebody with a pair of like marigold yellow washing up gloves on at the airport, and like almost a full hazchem suit. But then they had their mask. They were just wearing a chin strap, really.
Yeah.
It was totally missing the nose and mouth. And it was just, and I thought, well, what do? You've just got to see the lighter side in people's adaptations. We sometimes we over adapt. And I think you've just got to, remember that there's a whole lot of fate in among your efforts to stay well and see the irony in it as well.
I've been making myself laugh on this call because I reckon, Mark, you look like a really cool DJ with those headphones on right now. And I reckon I'm just been thinking that you have like this underground DJ career. They're good setup.
I probably know less about music than most humans.
Okay, very good. Yeah, that's good.
Pip, we'll wrap things up in a moment, but I have a question that will resonate with a lot of people. How big a role does spirituality play for those people that are spiritual right now?
I think that if you already have a spiritual faith, that's part of the wonderful ability to let go a little bit and assume that the world's not on your shoulders alone. And that's extremely valuable. But the basis of a lot of spirituality is also our connection to the rest of humanity, isn't it? And the ability to sort of reach out and be at our very best for other people. So they're useful things. But when we say spirituality, that doesn't have to define people or beliefs into categories. I think that there's something wonderful about just connecting in a spiritual sense to our communities and to other people around us at the minute. That's just super valuable. That's where the protection is. That's where the sense of in it together really is. And there's just such power in that for uncertain times. So yeah, I think it can be a very powerful way of seeing the world at the minute.
So a question for all of you. What are a few simple tips and strategies that you've been using that people can take away watching this to help with them overcoming fears and embracing the new world? Dill?
I think the biggest thing that I've learned and that I like to pass on is that people resent and try and steer away from having fears, and they put up, as we said, an armor and things like that. It's a completely natural part of life. You know what I mean? And we're all going through this together, and it's completely normal to feel the way that you're feeling, and don't fight it. But also don't internalize those fears, because I think talking about it and communicating it is the best ways to overcome them, but also become comfortable with them and use them as a positive part of your life.
And Mark, what's been working for you?
I moved overseas in the 90s. I lived in India for 4 years with the bank, and it was such a foreign lifestyle. And I saw so many of the expats really struggle because they couldn't replicate their life over there. They couldn't do the things that they were used to. So my realization was, I'll be here for up to 4 years. I'll go back to what was my lifestyle previously. So I may as well embrace everything that's different at the time. So I ate different foods. I went to different places. I made lots of local friends and didn't hang out so much with the expats. And so I just sort of embraced it, thinking it's going to change again one day. So I've taken that approach into this lockdown effectively. I like routine. I've got a different routine to what my normal routine is, but I've embraced it. It'll go for as long as it goes. I'll make the most of it. But at some stage, my life will go back to something that looks a bit more like it did before. I don't think it'll ever be exactly the same. I might work from home more than I've ever done before. But I think you just got to embrace what it is and then accept that, you're having an experience in your life that you probably look back on and say, wow, that was tough, but I'm glad I went through that.
And Pip, what can you leave us with?
I think the thing I would like to leave you with is the recognition that being resilient through something like this does not mean that you have to squash the emotion. There is nothing about resilience that means you can't also feel sadness or some loneliness or some frustration or, any other kind of negative emotion. You can be resilient at the same time as allowing space for your emotion. And that for me is what gives us what I call psychological space. So you allow room for all of it. It's a bit messy. It's going to be messy. The mess is okay. You can still find footsteps and still be resilient through that. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Another fantastic conversation. Dylan, how did you enjoy that?
Oh, awesome. And I mean, I love hearing about people, being vulnerable and hearing Mark about his situation at home and things like that. It's powerful, you know what I mean? And I just feel privileged to be a part of all these chats, mate.
Mark, so many takeaways for all of us based on the conversation we've had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll certainly be reading more of Pippa's work on the back of this. It kind of puts a context behind things that I've intrinsically thought and felt over the years, but never been certain, like being vulnerable with your staff, being certain that that's the right thing to do. But it's good to know that instinct is there. So I find this fascinating.
And Pippa, we so often hear that we learn about ourselves during the difficult times. We're learning a lot right now, aren't we?
Yeah, most certainly. I think that sort of idea that we improve through adversity is only correct is if we make meaning out of the lesson, and that's what these conversations are. And I think wonderful to be in conversation and share time with a leader like you, Mark, with an attitude like that. It's rare and it's fantastic, and I can't encourage you to keep doing that enough. And obviously Dill and you, Brad, too, to the openness to bring these kind of conversations forth with humanity and humour. It's just wonderful.
You're a legend, Pip. Love it.
Wonderful. Well said, Dylan. Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Pippa. And thank you for joining us for another chapter of the Wellbeing Conversation.
Hey everyone, Dylan Alcott again. Now, we touched on a few topics around mental health throughout that chat. Now, if that brought up anything for you, make sure you reach out to beyondblue.org.au, or their phone number is 1300 22 4636. You can also hit up Lifeline on 13 11 14, or reach out to the people within your ANZ teams and they'll be able to help. And here's a little taste on what's coming up on the next episode of the Wellbeing Conversation.
You can't work out what you want until you work out who you are. And most of us don't want to do that.
I was really struggling about my disability, and I didn't tell my brother, my best mate. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell anyone because I felt like a burden.
I think actually as Australians it's a bit harder, and even now I'm blushing at declaring what my purpose is.
We are the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves.
People often say, oh, don't say that you're different. You're not different, you're just like us. And I'm like, no, I am different. I have a disability, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that.
My son is so extraordinary. The people who take the time to get to know him just adore him. And he has made me an immeasurably better person. And it's just an extraordinary gift that my son gave me.